Hey guys, welcome back to another DirectX engine tutorial. In this tutorial, we're gonna do our resource manager. That's what we're gonna create, where all our resources is gonna be managed. So that's basically what a resource manager is about. So, so in this tutorial, we're gonna do that, and yeah. But before we do that, actually, before we continue writing, before we write the resource manager, I mentioned a couple of tutorials ago where I said that if you actually put if you actually put like you put a folder, a root folder, and inside of it you put your textures or whatever, this will not take account for it because when I wrote the tutorial, the shader tutorial or texture, I did not take account of actually putting it inside of a folder, and that should be I should have taken account of that. So we can update those classes first before we write our resource manager. So let's start that, shall we? Let me move this out of the way. Anyway, Um, so you want to open your shader. Oh, before I continue, I know you guys can see that I already have Resource Manager CPP here already, and the reason is being that I recorded this already beforehand, but that video, that that tutorial didn't come out right. It recorded audio from my webcam, and there's a lot of background noises going on in there, and it's so terrible to listen to. So I'm redoing this tutorial again, but I'm just gonna go along what I did in that tutorial, and so that's why I already created these resource manager and all the stuff that we were doing that I was gonna show you guys. But so hopefully you guys don't hate me for that. So but anyway, without further ado, you guys wanna just open a shader file. Open the header file and the CPP file. We can make some modifications in here. And beforehand, earlier we had this m name, and we had it as a sharp pointer. But in here we can exchange it to a string because strings is so much easier to do and to so much easier, because you're able to loop through the characters to find things and all that, and that's gonna be useful because that's gonna tell us what what is our root directory or extension, all that kind of stuff that we can need. So make sure you include the string file, and if I have not included this yet, or if you guys don't have it, then make sure you using namespace std. Um, Make sure you change this sharp pointer to a string, and the same thing goes to the mname. And once you have done that, you want to go to our CVP file and a destructor. Make sure you remove the delete from that name. And I'm not sure if you have to call clear or not, but I'm gonna put it there because I don't know. I don't know. I just feel like it feels a lot better that way. Yeah, I know you're not calling new on it or anything, but I don't know. I feel a lot better calling clear on it. So, excuse me. So then in here, our initialize function. Um, Beforehand, make sure you delete everything that was in here. Um, Delete everything. Make sure you leave it like this. Just return initialize whatever. And you want to create a string, call it shader file path, whatever. Set that to the shader file name, and then you want to set the m name to equal that shader path. And here, you want to find in that m name string, you want to find the forward slash, because find the last of that forward slash, because that would give us to the point where our root directory is at from the file. And we want to check to see if the position. Basically, this find out returns the position where this forward slash is at. So you want to make sure the position is greater than or equal to 0, because if it doesn't find it, then it will return -1. So if it's greater or equal to 0, that means it has a root directory. So you want to do is set the m name to and set that to subtract that. We basically want to remove all the root directory and just have the name of that file, which in our case is just texture. So where's my, sorry, showing my little kitty again. In here, our root directory in my case is going to be shaders /texture, and in here we're not gonna, when you pass in our shader file name here, we're not gonna pass our extension because in in my case I'm gonna name both files texture, and I hope you guys do the same thing. Otherwise, if you guys don't do that for some, I don't know why wouldn't you, but let's say if you didn't, then you probably want to create um another parameter in there for the other BS, but for other extension. But since both the files names gonna be named the same, I'm gonna be setting it in here. So make sure this m name is basically just gonna be the name of that file without the extension or the root directory. And and the reason why I want to have the name of the shader file is because in my resource manager, I'm gonna have a check to see if I have that file just the name of that file without the root or the extension. So that's why I'm deleting it from this m name. So then after that, you want to create a string for a BS file name. You want to set that to the shader file name, and basically you want to add the BS at the end for our extension, and the same thing goes for our pixel shader. And then in here, make sure you update the BS file to equal the, you want to get the .c underscore str, and the same thing for PS file name. So that's it for this shader file, and make sure for our getter function you also change it to a string. Nothing huge or anything. And then you want to go to our texture. In this texture class, we did not have a name. Maybe we want one because that way we are able to get this texture from a resource manager. Basically, you want to make sure you include a string as using namespace std. Get the string name. Make sure you call clear because I don't know, I just feel better that way. You don't even have to. I don't know. Maybe it's not even necessary, but I just like to have it there. And we want to do the same thing here. The only difference here is that in here, this file name, we actually are gonna include our extension. So when it comes to getting the m name, you want to make sure you want to remove the extension. So set the m name to equal file name. Same as that. Find the last forward slash, and if it's greater than 0, that means we do have one. Make sure you remove the root directory if it has one, and then we also want to remove our extension. And then we set that normally to the file name. So that's it for that. Make sure you also get the getter function for that as well if we haven't done so. Alrighty. We want to create a resource texture. Create a resource texture class for a header and CPP file. And once you created it, make sure you include our texture header file. You want to have a function, call it load or whatever you want to call it, pass in the device and a texture file name. You want to get a getter function for the texture and a getter for the string for the name, and create a private variable with texture pointer mTexture. So you want to go to our CPP file, make sure constructor is set it to null, delete the texture and the destructor. In the load, you want to create a new texture. You want to initialize it, pass in the device and texture file name. And if this initialize fails, make sure you delete the texture and return false. Otherwise, return true. And make sure you get the texture and get the name of that texture. So you also want to create a resource shader header and CPP file. Right. Move. Okay. Alright. So once you've done so, make sure you include a shader header file. You want to create two different load functions. You want to overwrite one of them. What's the override function? Overloading. There we go. One will have a load. You want to pass in device. It's normally the shader file name, the vertex function name, and the pixel function name. Another one you want to load and you want to pass in a shader. Make sure you get the getter functions for the shader and the name, and have a private variable for the shader pointer. And once you've done so, you want to go and head out to the CPP file. Make sure in the constructor you set it to null, and destructor, make sure you delete it. For the load function, for the first one that contains the device, HTML shader file, vertex, and pixel function name, you want to create a new shader, passing all the correct parameters to it. And you want to say if it's not initialized, if it didn't initialize correctly, make sure you delete the shader and return false, otherwise return true. And for other overloaded function, the one that adds in the shader as a parameter, you want to check to see if that shader does not equal null. And if it does, then it's return false, otherwise set the shader to equal the shader. And make sure if it's initialized, if it's not initialized correctly, make sure you delete it and return false, otherwise return true. And make sure you get the getter instead of getter functions for the shader and the name of that shader. So it's simple. It's a simple class for resource shader and resource texture, so it's nothing huge going on. I hope you guys understood it. If you guys have any questions, let me know. But um, it's very simple, you know. So there's nothing like huge going on. So, but once you finish your resource shader header and CPP file, you want to create another class, call it resource manager. And once you done the proper stuff that you need to create this header file, include the resource shader and texture. You want to include IOStream, include your vector, and add a using namespace std. And once you've done so, you want to create a function. Call it load shader resource, pass it in a device, HTML shader file name, vertex function name, pixel function name. Create another function, load shader resource is another overloaded function, and you want to pass in a shader pointer as a parameter. And then we also want to have a load texture resource, and you're just gonna pass in device and texture file name. And you want to create a getter function that will return the shader pointer and the texture pointer by its name. So get the shader by name and get texture by name, which was the reason why we wanted this, you know, because that's how we can get it. And make sure you have a static resource get instance, because this class is gonna be just an instance. I guess a singleton, I guess you can call it. You want to create a private variable. Make sure your constructor is a private because you only need one of these. You're not going to create multiple of this stuff, so and you're not able to call new anywhere else. So basically, that's what this is for. Make sure you create a vector or resource texture pointers, and same thing for your shaders. And make sure you create your static instance as well. And once you've done so, you want to go to the CPP file. Make sure you call your instance to null on top. Constructor doesn't have anything. Make sure in the destructor you want to delete them. So while it's empty, delete the first one in the array, or yeah, I guess you call it an array, right? And erase the first element. And it's gonna do the same thing for a shader. So now here comes where we want to load resource shader, load shader resource, the one that passes the device, it's showing the shader file name, vertex and pixel function name. You want to create a new resource shader, and you want to load it. And if it fails, make sure you delete that, and just create a cout telling you that you failed to load it, and return. Otherwise, that means you successfully loaded it, and you want to add it to the list of the shaders. And just create a cout telling you that you successfully loaded correctly. For the other overloaded function, load shader resource is the one that passes the shader pointer. We want to make sure if it equals null, return. Otherwise, you want to create a new resource shader, and you want to load that shader. And if it fails, just delete that, and just say unable to load shader. Otherwise, make sure you return right. And otherwise, it means you successfully loaded it, and you want to add it to the list of shaders, and you say you successfully loaded that shader. And the problem here is it doesn't tell you what shader it is, which I guess in here you can a shader, you know, resource shader. You want to pass in get name. And here you're not going to be able to tell because since it failed to load, you're not going to know the name of that function. So I mean, if you guys can figure out a better way of doing that, I mean, it's no really bad way of doing it, but anyway, um, then you want to go to the lower get textures resource, the loader one, the one that has the device and texture file name. You want to create a new resource texture. Make sure that it loads, and if it doesn't load correctly, make sure you delete it, and we just see out saying that it was unable to load with the texture file name and return. Otherwise, add it to the list of textures and just create a C out saying, hey, successfully loaded, yay, or something like that. Then for the get shader by name, you want to loop through the shader size. No, I mean to a list of shader size. You want to loop through the shader list. Make sure you make it more simple. Create a resource. Set it to the one with that index. You want to get the name, resource get name, and basically when I say strcmp, pass in the shader name as the first parameter, and the resource shader name dot c underscore str, and if it does equal, if it's true that these are the same name, then you want to return the shader. Otherwise, return null. Make sure you pass as a not in there, an exclamation point, not strcmp that, because that if this is true, it returns 0. Otherwise, it returns 1, I believe. So that's why you want the opposite of that. And get texture by name is the same way as this, but just with the resource texture. So make sure you could copy paste that. Make sure you call it resource texture. But either way, it's the same thing as the top. Get the resource texture, get the name of that texture, and make sure if it equals, and if it does, return that texture, and otherwise return null. And make sure you get the instance for a final function. If it equals null, create a new resource manager and return that instance. So hopefully you guys understood that. If you guys have any questions, let me know. I wish I was able to write it while I was doing this tutorial, but since I failed, my bad, guys. Apologize. Hope you guys understood it. If you were following me correctly, you can pause the video anywhere. There's no rush. Please pause the video. Make sure you actually copy the same way. Before you actually ask me questions. So, yeah. Anyway, once you have done so, you want to go to our engine.h and make sure you want to pass in our resource manager in there and create a resource pointer in private. And after you've done so, you want to go to the CPP, the engine CPP. Make sure resource manager equals null, and make sure you delete it in the destructor of the engine. Otherwise, in the initialize of the engine, you want to create a new shader, a new resource manager, and you want to load the texture and the shader. So the texture, I added it in my texture folder. Not sure what you guys call your folder when you pass in your texture, or you don't even have to have anything. You might just have it as like that. That will work fine as well. But I had it in my folder texture, so I'm gonna pass it in like that. With the extension, you want to load a shader resource, and you want to pass in a new texture shader. I have my texture. I have my shaders in the shader folder, so I'm gonna pass it in shaders texture. Make sure you do not include the extension, unless you're creating your own stuff. Then go ahead and put it in there. But since I'm gonna be naming the same for the pixel and vertex file names, I'm gonna name it the same way. I don't need to pass it in an extension since I already do it. Anyways, once you initialize the texture shader, you want to initialize the texture vertex shader and the texture pixel shader, which is the main functions inside of that shaders. And once you've done so, make sure you delete the new. I know earlier I said new texture, blah blah blah. And instead of doing that, you want to make sure you want to use resource manager, get shader by name, and you just want to pass the texture. because that's why I named it here. If you want to name it differently, make sure you want to maybe pass in a different parameter in here and set the name of it that way. It's up to you. This is how I'm doing it. So you want to make sure if you did it my way, then make sure you get the shader by name by the name of that texture file. So you just texture, and make sure you cast it as a texture shader pointer. And in the sprite initialize, I'm not sure why I called it in here, but make sure you just name it by the name of that file name. And once you're done, so you want to go inside our sprite CPP file. In our initialize, make sure inside the texture you want to get the instance resource. Make sure you include the header file. And once you've done so, you want to get the instance and get the texture by name by that texture file name. And once you've done so, and that's all we have to do, guys. This is our resource manager. Once you run it, it should play correctly. There you go. It should work. So hopefully you guys made it work. If there was any issue corresponding of this, make sure you go back to the video. Make sure you follow me correctly. Pause the video if you have to. And if you still have any issues, just ask me a question, and I'll do my best to answer it. But yeah, I hope you guys got it working. And this is it. This is our resource manager tutorial. Resource manager is a very simple class to do. Our next tutorial that we can do is creating an entity and an entity manager. I know in my DirectX11 tutorial I created one of these before, but at that time I'm not saying it was a bad manager, but I might do a better one this time. Since I know a little bit more coding than I did back then. So we can create our entity and an entity manager, and that's how we can continue, guys. So I hope you guys liked this tutorial. Thumbs up if you liked it. Tell other people about this tutorial or my channel or whatever. But yeah, I'll see you guys next time, and if there's any questions, let me know, alright? So, I'll see you guys next time, and we'll do our entity manager class. So, signing out, sayonara.